Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video that I found very, very particularly interesting. And I wasn't going to do any more videos kind of about this subject. One, because I feel that I've already kind of done this subject dozens and dozens of times where I'm almost kind of beating a dead horse here. But every once in a while, there still is going to be a video that I think is pretty much going to be a gold mine in terms of what can be revealed or what can be taken away from the video. And oftentimes, I tend to review videos where I may not agree somewhat with their perspective. Such channels like Dante's Boxing Nation, Boxing Eagle, Aki TV, Blue Blood Sports TV, Champ Side, channels like those. And don't get me wrong, that is not me saying that I disagree with everything that they say. But a big part of the reason why I have reviewed LDBC and new media videos, especially within that of the sport of boxing, is because I can usually tell that there is a deeper narrative that they're trying to play afoot. And that a lot of the times when they criticize other fighters, it's not really based off in something of substance. It's really based off of something in a deeper root of hatred or something overall that really a lot of the times can be proven hypocritical or something that doesn't really make any sense. And one of their main targets has always been Saul Canelo Alvarez. And one of the narratives that we've always heard about Canelo Alvarez from them, which is that he's overrated, that he does not have a good resume, that he's cherry picking opponents. And that's not me saying that, in my view, that Canelo Alvarez, that he's made the best of moves every single time in his career. But at the end of the day, Canelo is a four-weight division champion. And he's not just some simple four-weight champion like what an Adrian Broner or what a Mikey Garcia is. You can tell the calibers of four-weight division champions or multiple weight division champions when you can recall at least a good 5 to 10 names on their resume. I can list you off 15 names off of Canelo Alvarez's resume, probably within the past 10 years, just off the top of my head. When we talk about Mikey Garcia and Adrian Broner, I can probably list you about five. And in Adrian Broner's cases, most of those big fights that he was in, he pretty much lost. So it is what it is. Anyways, the video that I'm going to be reviewing here, and reason B of why I wasn't going to review this, is because this is a Patreon video, and I don't like to review Patreon all too much because I think that that's something that, of course, you should pay for. But as long as I'm not reviewing the full segments, hopefully I won't be giving out away the full content. I just don't like to review Patreon content because a lot of the times, of course, that's meant to be paid for. And of course, that's taking a living away a little bit. So I don't want to put out the full segment. I only wanted to put out what I thought would be necessary. And this is going to be the Canelo Alvarez segment. And the big question is going to be, is he overrated as a fighter? Has his resume been massively overrated as a fighter? Or is his resume for real? And of course, if you've seen my channel for a while, you know already what I think. But the channel that we're going to review today is a channel that I've always held in great high regard, and that's going to be Chronicles of Judah 144. For those of you, of course, that are not familiar with Chronicles of Judah 144, Chronicles of Judah 144 used to have a YouTube channel, I believe, several years ago. Unfortunately, of course, he no longer posts on YouTube. I wish that he still did, of course, so a greater amount of people could see his breakdowns and videos, because in my view, he certainly is one of the deeper, also more intellectual, and more logical and objective commentators out there. I think that he is a great breakdown artist and a great commentator, as well as several other channels as well. Hatman Strikes Back, Boxing Wave, and those are just some, YouTube channels on boxing, but some other channels as well that are great also for basketball, football, whatever you want to call it, or whatever sport that we're talking about. Tennis as well. I tend to watch that sport. But Chronicles of Judah 144, in my view, he pretty much is the full package, especially when you talk about not just sports analyzations, but other analyzations as well. At least analyzations that I would tend to agree with. But enough dilly-dally pretty much of this introduction. Let's get straight into it, because Chronicles of Judah 144, he's going to be saying a lot of the same things that I've been saying about Canelo Alvarez now for years. So let's get straight into it.
But I do think that Canelo also.
And of course, by the way, before we get into the video, this was a segment, I believe, on Max on Boxing. And Max on Boxing, I believe, I don't know where it's at anymore. Of course, it used to be on HBO. Maybe it's still on HBO, although I highly doubt it because they no longer have HBO Boxing. I assume it's on ESPN. And this was the Max's Mailbag segment, which is basically where commentators, where they send their questions in certain regards to Max Kellerman, and Max Kellerman tries his best to answer those type of questions that they ask him, which I think actually is a great idea. I might even myself start reviewing some of these segments because a lot of the questions on here, in my view, they were good questions and questions that I see a lot of fans and a lot of channels myself, also, ask. But anyway.
Also has great natural craft and ability.
I think it'd be pretty tough for Triple G to get a decision in a close fight. This from Antonio. How come you don't call out Canelo for fighting subpar comp? How is he still ranked higher than Bivol on ESPN's pound for pound list? Clearly, Bivol just crushed him. I think I know the answer to these questions.
Well, I think I know the answer to why you're so accusatory, Mr. Antonio Reed. You're most likely a wokey. You're most likely a Terrence Crawford super fan who's trying to live your racial animus through the sports world, which is one of the most dangerous things that the so-called black man can do. Once again, this is not 1936 where we have to huddle around the radio and listen to Joe Louis against Max Schmeling or Jim Braddock or some shit. This is 2022. The so-called black man should not be living out his racial pride through sports. There's nothing wrong, in my view, in rooting for, certain athletes because they're of our nation or of our race or what have you. But when you get so caught up in it that you try to turn it into some type of religion or some type of cult worship, that's a major problem. And the reason why I'm
100% agreed. And that goes for anybody in my view. And the reason why so many people, whenever you criticize their favorite fighter or their favorite athlete, they basically take it as a personal attack because they've gotten so infatuated with that person that they almost become in love with that person. Like if you take a look at Shannon Sharp whenever he talks about LeBron James, whenever someone is criticizing LeBron James, even if it seems like fair criticism, and that's why it's very important not to be a fan. Because even when fair criticism seems to come afoot, you're not going to be able to take it in the right direction. You're not going to be able to take a look at that with any sense of logic and objectivity. Because any sense of criticism that is going to come that person's way that you're pretty much in love with, you're going to take as a personal attack. That's why whenever we have a debate, or that's why whenever I do my breakdowns, a lot of the times I cannot take what Dante's Boxing Nation or Boxing Ego or some of these other dudes say seriously. And don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that it's not great what they do with their channels and that they have a following. That's a great, great thing. That's a form of self-expression, and it's also a form of independence. I have a great amount of respect for that. But what I don't have a great amount of respect for is the clear hypocrisy and double standards that they have for a certain amount of narratives that they try to put out there. And don't try to tell me all this bullshit about how Canelo Alvarez was overrated and he was never the number one pound per pound fighter because he won't fight the elite black fighters or all this other shit when he's been in the ring with a great fighter after a great fighter. But then you give praise to Gervonta Tank Davis or Jamal Charlo or Terrence Bud Crawford for, basically fighting B and C level competition. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, one day they would literally say that Canelo Alvarez, that he's avoiding certain big fights by fighting Billy Joe Saunders and, Caleb Plant. Even though years prior or the year after Canelo Alvarez fought them, as soon as they were about to fight somebody else that they were trying to push, like a Demetrius Boo Andrade or that of, say, a David Benavidez, all of a sudden it's a big fight. And I already made a video on this. Like Caleb Plant, when Canelo fought him, was allegedly this weak European white boy. But then as soon as, David Benavidez fought him, they're like, oh, we can't wait. This is one of the biggest fights in boxing. What are you talking about? How is it one of the biggest fights in boxing when Caleb Plant was allegedly a weak opponent? And David Benavidez is even better than Canelo Alvarez. This is what we're supposed to believe. And then Gervonta Tank Davis, he's supposedly, allegedly facing this, these A-grade level fighters. Like, dude, he's fighting Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Rolly Romero. Like, let's chill the fuck out. Rolly Romero literally the other day fought a 40-year-old and from what I hear, nearly lost a damn fight. If it wasn't for one of the worst stoppages in history from what I hear. Now, once again, I can't commentate on that myself because I didn't watch the fight. So it is what it is. So like I said, let's stop the bullshit. Like I said, the reason why I like to review their videos is because I can tell the difference between when someone truly believes something or when someone is full of shit. I can smell bullshit from a mile away, and there's no offense against those channels, that I tend to review. But a lot of the times, they're full of shit. It just is what it is.
I'm going to this degree in regards to this brother's comment. It's very obvious that there's an ulterior motive for why he's alleging that Canelo was fighting subpar competition. There was a stretch where Canelo was fighting a bunch of guys who, might not be considered the most talented fighters in the world, but at the end of the day, they did have championship belts. So they were.
And I don't even agree with the fact, and Dante and some of these other channels would not even agree with the fact that those fighters were not talented. Because once again, Billy Joe Saunders versus Demetrius Andrade, according to some of these channels, it was one of the biggest fights in boxing when the Billy Joe Saunders versus Demetrius Andrade fight was about to happen. Then literally as soon as the Billy Joe Saunders versus Canelo Alvarez fight happened, oh, he's fighting a guy with no power. He's fighting a guy that, is a weak European white boy. And if you want to claim that Billy Joe Saunders maybe isn't on the level of Andrade or David Benavidez, some would say that he's not on the level of Charlo. I don't personally agree with that. I've already stated this. I think Jamal Charlo is probably one of the more overrated fighters within the past 10 years. It just is what it is. But anyways, when it comes out, if you want to say that he's not as skilled as those guys, no problem. But be consistent about it. It's like, first of all, I believe that Billy Joe Saunders wasn't a great fighter when Canelo Alvarez fought him. Because Billy Joe Saunders not only was a two-weight division champion, he had decent work at the middleweight division. Like, he beat guys like Andy Lee. He beat guys like David Lemieux. He dominated those guys. He also beat Chris Eubank Jr. Now, none of those guys, in my view, are A-grade fighters. But at the end of the day, they're probably bigger wins than any of the wins that Demetrius Andrade has in his career. And Billy Joe Saunders probably has a similar resume to that of Jamal Charlo. And are we really sure that if Jamal Charlo and Billy Joe Saunders got in the ring, that Jamal Charlo would win that fight? Because to be quite honest with you, if the best version of Billy Joe Saunders got in that ring, I would probably bet on Billy Joe Saunders to win that fight. Just my personal view. I don't think Jamal Charlo beats any of the clear A-grade fighters from 160 to 168. I truly don't. Talking about Andre, Benavidez, Saunders, Plant, I'm not sure if he beats any of those guys. And Caleb Plant, once again, apparently that fight was so trash when it was going to happen with Canelo Alvarez, but then it happens with David Benavidez. Oh, it's one of the biggest fights in boxing. Now one might be able to say, well, that's because Benavidez and Caleb Plant, that they're still, natural 168 pounders. But I'm not really sure if you can go that far. You could say that it's a good 168 pound fight, but to say it's one of the biggest fights in boxing, and it was, then what does that say about Caleb Plant? What it says is that he was a decent opponent. That's not me saying he's A+, but he was clearly in that A-grade category. He was one of the top contenders.
So they were guys that he was going to have to fight. A lot of those European fighters. Y'all know who I'm talking about. But at the end of the day, Canelo's fought too much top-notch competition, especially too many highly skilled black American fighters, from Danny Jacobs to Floyd Mayweather or so-called...
Hold the phone, Judah. Are you telling me that Canelo Alvarez, 4-weight division champion, guy that has over 60 fights in his record, guy that has unified a division, guy that has beaten guys like Gennady Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, Araceli Lara, all these other guys, you're telling me that the stuff that I've been hearing from the LDBC and new media has been fraudulent? You're telling me that Canelo Alvarez, that he's not the most overrated fighter in boxing, that his resume is not weak, that he's just not cherry-picking fighter to see when they're at their weakest? Are you serious? Because I've been hearing wrong information.
So-called black fighters, period. What's the brother from Cuba that he fought? The left-hander? I mean, whether you...
Araceli Lara.
You think that he won or lost?
And I would also debate that Araceli Lara could have debatably won that fight. But one could also debate that Araceli Lara could have been a little bit more offensive-minded in that fight. And had he been more offensive-minded and tried to go to the body against Canelo and been a little bit more engaging, he probably clearly could have won the fight, at least debatably. But you really can't call that fight a robbery because both Canelo and Lara kind of got theirs. Now, if you thought Lara won the fight, no problem. But don't sit here and tell me that, well, we can't even count that win because it was a clear robbery. No, because it really wasn't. It was a close fight. And at the end of the day, Lara could have been a little bit more offensive. Now, the first Gennady Golovkin fight, for example, I thought Canelo Alvarez clearly lost. But in the rematch, Gennady Golovkin blew it because Canelo Alvarez took it to a level and he showed certain skills and a certain style that Gennady Golovkin was not able to handle. And even some of these channels like Dante and some of these other guys, they claimed that the first fight was a quote unquote draw, even though I never personally believed that. I personally thought Gennady won the first fight clearly, and I thought that it was a very bad draw decision, just in my view. Adelaide Bird, what a shocker. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, a lot of these guys like Aki TV and Dante, they were claiming that it could have been a draw. That's what they were claiming. And then all of a sudden for the rematch, and now that Canelo is the number one enemy, and no longer is Gennady Golovkin, all of a sudden Canelo Alvarez, oh, well, he should have lost both of those fights. Well, why are you going back on your word? Why all of a sudden now that Canelo Alvarez is enemy number one and not Gennady Golovkin anymore, and Canelo is the main target that you have to throw down when it comes down to it, why is it all of a sudden that, oh, well, he should have lost both of those fights? You know, we already know the answer to that question, basically. You know, as Dante would say, we know what time it is. Like I said, I can smell bullshit when it's going on. Like, just stop it.
Lost those fights. He got into the ring with those fighters.
And I also state this because a lot of people always like to use this. Like, I did a video the other day where Teddy Atlas said, well, Canelo Alvarez, he's not really on the level, of other great Mexican fighters. He's overrated. He's not the greatest Mexican fighter. He's not Chavez. He's not this. Well, let me also put it this way. And Teddy's not the only one that's ever used this. And this is what a lot of people kind of use with certain fighters when they like to hate, especially when they don't want a current fighter or a current athlete surpassing their former great athlete or their former athlete that they were a very big fan of. But if we're going to be real about Chavez Sr. here, and I'm not in any way saying that he was not an all-time great fighter, but why are we trying to act like he never had problems in his career? Or that there was never controversial decisions in his career, or that he was never close to losing a fight during his prime? Because that's just not the case. Like, people take a look at Canelo, or Dante will take a look at Manny Pacquiao because they don't like them. And they'll say, oh, well, we can't even count Canelo Alvarez's wins over Gennady Golovkin or over Araceli Lara because they're controversial. So we really can't even count those victories. Or, oh, we'll take a look at Manny Pacquiao. We really can't even count his victories over Juan Manuel Marquez or some of these other guys because they're quote-unquote controversial. No, controversial is Araceli Lara versus Paul Williams. That's controversial. Like, literally a big, huge robbery. That's what controversial is, okay? Even slightly controversial, maybe something like a Sean Porter versus Yordenis Ugas. Canelo versus Lara was a fight that easily could have went either way. When you talk about the first Golovkin fight, yes, that was controversial in my view. The second fight was not. Canelo Alvarez, in my view, just pulled it out. And I believe on all scorecards, they all three gave it to Canelo, I believe 7-5. So no, that's not a controversial fight. And for the Manny Pacquiao fights, in the second and third one, I scored them both for Manny Pacquiao. So are those really controversial fights? Or were they just very close fights that could have went either way? You can't call a fight that was very close and could have went either way as quote-unquote controversial. Do they ever say this when Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez lost to that of, Juan Francisco Estrada? They never say that shit. And if we're going to go by those standards, no problem. But then let's apply those standards to everybody else. Because now all of a sudden we cannot count Sugar Ray Leonard's win over Marvin Hagler because there's thousands upon thousands of people who believe that fight was controversial. All right, we all of a sudden cannot count the draw against Sugar Ray Leonard against Tommy Hearns. Now, in my view, that was heavily controversial, so I wouldn't really count that draw anyway. In my view, Tommy Hearns ended up winning that fight. But why are we sitting here trying to pretend that Manny Pacquiao and Canelo, that they're the only great fighters that ever had controversial decisions? Like, certain people will bring up Sugar Ray Leonard and other fighters like that they tend to like in terms of all-time great conversations, and they're like, oh, well, you can't even compare them, and they had certain controversial decisions. Like, dude, Sugar Ray Leonard and Chavez and even Mayweather, they had certain fights that would be quote-unquote controversial in their career. When you take a look at Sugar Ray Leonard, is he all of a sudden not an all-time great fighter anymore because he should have debatably lost to Marvin Hagler or Tommy Hearns rematch, and he also lost the first Roberto Duran fight? Like, are we all of a sudden going to say, well, we really cannot count the Marvin Hagler win. It has to be a race. Like that just doesn't make any sense. At the end of the day, if a fight is close and maybe a fighter does a little bit more or the judges decide to give that fighter the decision, and if it's a fight that could go either way, you have to give the credit to that fighter. All of a sudden is, Andre Ward, did the wins over Sergey Kovalev not count? Does that first win not count? Because many people believe that Sergey Kovalev won that fight. Do all of a sudden, we not count that victory that Andre Ward has? Like, let's stop. And then, people talking about Canelo Alvarez saying, oh, well, he's not an all-time great Mexican fighter. First of all, and I've already stated this, what Mexican fighters, and you would really have to confront Teddy Atlas on this, which Mexican fighters are above Canelo Alvarez, really? And that's not me saying that he's the undisputed greatest Mexican fighter of all time or anything like that, but I've already stated this several times. Who, in terms of Mexican boxing history, is really above Canelo Alvarez? Because it's not Marco Antonio Barrera. Let's stop the bullshit about a dude that lost to Junior Jones twice, once by knockout, lost to Eric Morales once, also lost to 2 fights, got his ass whooped by Manny Pacquiao, is greater than Canelo Alvarez. Let's stop. Eric Morales, who also got his ass whooped by that of Manny Pacquiao, lost a trilogy to that of Marco Antonio Barrera, and lost a couple of other fights. Those 2 guys you're going to sit here and tell me are greater than Canelo Alvarez? Absolutely not. A guy who won the majority of the fights in his career, a dude that is 5'9" with a 71-inch arm reach at most, went from 154 all the way up to 175 and became a champion in every single one of those weight divisions and fought multiple A-grade contenders. Let's stop the cap. Let's stop the bullshit, as people would say. All right, let's also go on to Juan Manuel Marquez. Marquez was the greatest Mexican fighter of that 2000s, 2010s era. But you're talking about a guy that lost to Manny Pacquiao in, that little quadruple fight, I believe, or that little, fourth timing, not trilogy, excuse me, but, that fourth timing little series. He also lost to Timothy Bradley. He lost a couple of other fights. He was never thought of as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter of his era. And that, in my view, doesn't always put you above a fighter. But Canelo, once again, he's a 4-weight division champion, I believe, just like Juan Manuel Marquez is. And he won the majority of his big fights. So it's like, come on. Like, what are we talking about? And then we go to Chavez and we go to Salvador Sanchez. I can understand maybe those 2 fighters. In my personal view, Salvador Sanchez, he just didn't have enough accomplishments in his career. Unfortunately, he passed away very young. But it is what it is. He didn't get enough accomplished. You cannot put him, in my view, as the greatest of all time. Maybe in terms of skill, certain people would. I didn't watch enough of him, so I can't really say that. I would have to judge him for myself. But once again, he had nowhere near the same amount of accomplishments as a Canelo Alvarez, so he can't really be there. And then we get to Chavez Sr., and I don't mind if you have Chavez Sr. as the best Mexican fighter of all time, or at least as the greatest. But when Teddy Atlas, for example, stated that, oh, well, Canelo, he probably should have lost to Lara, he probably should have lost to this, he lost to Mayweather every single round. And I understand that, but I give Canelo a little bit of a break for losing to Mayweather because no one really was on the level of Mayweather, at least certainly during his era, when it came down to it. And when we talk about Chavez, like, do people forget that Chavez got his ass kicked against Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker and got one of the most controversial, biggest robbery decisions of all time in a draw against Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker? Like, they were trying to give Chavez that fight, and they couldn't even give him the fight. He performed so bad against Sweet Pea Whitaker, they had to give him a damn draw. So let's stop this bullshit about, all these fighters that, oh, well, these guys, you can't count them because they had controversial decisions. Almost every great fighter in their career has either a close fight or somewhat of a controversial decision. Now, if it's super controversial, once again, like when Lara lost to Williams and it was a mega robbery, or Gennady Golovkin in the first Canelo Alvarez fight, or something of a sort, then you have a different side, you have a different point. But if you're talking about just a close fight that could have went either way, like Ward versus Kovalev, in my view, Lomachenko versus Teofimo Lopez, or, what's another fight? Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler, or, Manny Pacquiao versus Marquez, Canelo versus Lara, Canelo versus Gennady Golovkin too. You can't hold those against those fighters because they're going to be competitive. They're 2 great fighters getting into the ring, period. It just is what it is. And also, a lot of people don't mention with Julio Cesar Chavez that he probably would have lost that Meldrick Taylor first fight, if not for probably one of the more poorer stoppages in that of boxing history. So let's stop saying that Chavez was this quote-unquote immortal compared to Canelo Alvarez, because if we're really going to go there, Canelo Alvarez probably was the more skilled fighter of the 2. Debatably anyway. But because of Chavez's, kind of band of work, I would say that both him and Canelo, that they're somewhat in the same conversation. But let's stop this bullshit about how Chavez was this immortal compared to Canelo Alvarez, because it just wasn't true.
At the end of the
And
day,
I've already mentioned stuff about Oscar. Once again, Oscar De La Hoya, one of the most overrated fighters in boxing history. No doubt about it, 100%. Lost almost every big fight in his career. Like, even lost to Sugar Shane Mosley. And Sugar Shane Mosley, in my view, although a great boxer, very limited in his skill set against other great fighters. Oscar lost to him twice. And Oscar was outsized. He outsized Shane twice. So it just is what it is. Now, in my view, Oscar probably should have won the rematch last time I remember watching it. But let's stop this bullshit about how Canelo isn't better than Oscar and Marco Antonio Barrera and Juan Manuel Marquez and, Eric Morales. Let's stop the bullshit. All right, like I said, you have Salvador Sanchez and you have Chavez. Those are really the only two Mexican fighters, even if them, that are in the same category as Canelo.
the day, Erislandy Lara, that's his name. He also fought the brother who trained under Ann Wolfe, the power punching brother who had a lot of the personal problems. His name is
Yes, James Kirkland. I don't really count him as a great fighter, to be quite honest with you. But like I said, when you talk about the A grade names that Canelo has fought, you can list nearly a dozen on his resume. In my personal view, Lara, Golovkin, that's not even counting Mayweather. Of course, I don't really count Mayweather because he didn't win that fight, but he still did fight him. And that was when Canelo was 23 years old. And that's not me really using that as an excuse. That's just me saying that I don't think that Canelo Alvarez, that in terms of the skill, that he was really prepared for Mayweather to come at him that hard. Certain people say, well, Mayweather was 36 years old. Yes, but he was a great 36 years old. And once again, that's not me making an excuse. If Canelo was greater than Floyd, then in my view, he's supposed to beat him in that fight at least somewhat, or at least accomplish further things in the sport. I don't think that Canelo is the fighter that Floyd is. I don't think that he's quite as great as Floyd. But once again, he's probably in my top 30 fighters of all time. In that same, ranking as Hopkins, in that same ranking as Joe Calzaghe, Andre Ward, Tommy Hearns, probably even above Tommy Hearns. To be honest with you, probably all those fighters would debatably be above Tommy Hearns. I have no idea why Tommy Hearns get in the conversation as much, as the top 10 fighters of all time. I never understood it. The man lost almost every big fight in his career against a fighter that could pretty much reach him.
it's slipping my mind right now, but Canelo stopped him in like 1 or 2 rounds.
But once again, when we talk about the A grade fighters, Canelo has Billy Joe Saunders on there, who in my view was an A grade fighter. Callum Smith, who was probably around the A minus level fighter. Now, of course, certain people say, well, he was not the most talented. I don't know if I would agree with that. Now, of course, is he as talented as an Andrade or, someone as say like, maybe even a Charlo? Maybe not, but, he is, in my view, around that A minus category because not only of his size and his power, but Callum Smith won the Super 6 Series tournament in that division. A lot of people don't remember that. He was the Ring Magazine champion of that weight division. And that was when David Benavidez, that was when, I believe Caleb Plant with it, they were all there. Now, of course, those fights didn't happen, and maybe some people could argue that those fighters were a little bit younger, but I believe that David Benavidez, he won a title, I think, when Callum Smith was there. So it's not like Callum Smith was just some bum. Now, I do agree that both the Smith brothers, they're limited fighters, but I don't think that I can go as far to say that he wasn't talented. It just is what it is. And then, of course, you talk about Caleb Plant. In my view, he was A grade, but on the A minus level. And now, of course, Gennady Golovkin, Erislandy Lara, Danny Jacobs, Austin Trout, I believe Miguel Cotto, Sergey Kovalev, all these names on his record. And I'm probably even forgetting a couple. That's not even counting Amir Khan and Chavez, Jr. and James Kirkland, fighters that, in my view, aren't quite A grade level, but Canelo still beat them anyway.
So Canelo has an excellent resume. And Bivol defeating Canelo would not put Bivol as the number one pound for pound fighter or put him above Canelo Alvarez on a pound for pound list. Bivol was really supposed to win that fight. Canelo is a natural 154, 160 pound fighter.
Thank you, sir. I've been saying that now for I don't know how many years, which is why I always rank Canelo as my number one pound for pound fighter. Because people tried to say, like these channels, especially that, oh, Terrence, look how dominant he is. Like the dude has a 74-inch reach and he's 5'8". He was fighting guys that, in my view, were always a little bit under him in terms of size. Now, the 140-pound weight division, they were around his same size. But the 135-pound weight division, like debatably the biggest win in Terrence's career is that Yuriorkis Gamboa win. And he was decently smaller than him. it's still an A grade win if you want to count it like that. But Canelo is beating guys sometimes decently bigger than him, at least taller and lengthier than him. Terrence is not doing that. Like to compare the Bivol and Canelo Alvarez fight to that of the Terrence Bud Crawford and whoever he's gonna fight, Terrence Bud Crawford would probably have to fight a prime Gennady Golovkin.
Who just does not want to lose the amount of weight that it would take to continue to campaign at 154 or 160. He's only 5'7". I mean, I'll give him credit. He's
Agreed, sir. Thank you. I've been saying that. So when some of these guys say that it's a quote unquote excuse that Canelo Alvarez lost that fight because of size, no, it's not an excuse at all. It's just is what it is. Now, in my view, Canelo, of course, should have put on a much better performance, even with the size, because in my view, it was a winnable fight for Canelo. Of course, I somewhat agree with Judah that Bivol was supposed to win that fight because of the size combined with the skill set that he had. But on top of that, Canelo Alvarez is like 5'9" with a 71-inch reach. The guy has grown a little bit into the 168-pound weight division, but he's not even as big as those guys. Like, he's not as big as Caleb Plant or Danny Jacobs or Jamal Charlo. He's not as big as any of those guys, man. Like, Canelo Alvarez is a natural-built 160-pounder, and he wasn't really even the size of Gennady Golovkin, but yet he can still beat all these guys. What does that say about his skill set?
he's someone who you might call quote unquote big bone. So he can move up to 168, but he's definitely not a 175 pounder.
Agreed, 100%.
And anybody who watched that fight could see that unless Canelo got a stoppage, he was not going to win that fight. He was too short.
Well, in my view, the main problem with Canelo Alvarez in that fight was that he had no stamina whatsoever past round 4, nothing whatsoever. Not even a drop of stamina. His stamina was completely drained. In my view, Canelo Alvarez, he could have put on a better performance and possibly won the fight, but if his stamina would have to be much, much better. And maybe it's not going to be much better because maybe Bivol's size, maybe his power, maybe it's going to be just too much. I don't know.
His reach was too short. I said myself that I've always doubted some of the legitimacy of his victory over Kovalev at 175. That's just me. Okay? I think that...
And Judah, of course, is alleging that there was possibly an under-the-table deal between that and Canelo versus Kovalev. And I can somewhat understand that he's not the only one that has alleged that. And usually I give more credit to Judah because Judah usually does certain research. And whenever he says something, there's usually reasons behind it. And he doesn't have a secret narrative afoot, at least usually, from what I know. But anyways, the reason why I have to kind of fight back on that a little bit, or the reason why I kind of have to say, well, hold on here for a minute, is because I would really need to know the evidence or why you believe that is. Now, apparently from what I hear, Kovalev did get a 3-fight deal after that. So is it possible that they said, listen here, you were once upon a time a great champion, but, you're not the champion you once were. We can slip you a couple more millions under the table. You can live quite nice. And then on top of that, we'll still promote your fights. And then still, we'll have a couple fights, a little bit more for you. Is it possible that they did that? It's very possible. But I need more evidence behind that than just, oh, well, Sergey Kovalev didn't look the same to me because he wasn't throwing the same amount of right hands. Like, that's the main argument that everyone tries to say. But if you take a look at that fight, in my view, Kovalev looked scared to throw against Canelo Alvarez because Canelo was always ready to counter, especially to the body. So, once again, is it possible that there was a deal under the table? It's possible. Is it also possible that Canelo was just a better fighter on a much better role than Sergey Kovalev and was much better defensively and was beating a Kovalev that probably wasn't the same crusher Kovalev that beat Andre Ward, although still an A-grade fighter in my view? Yeah, it's very possible.
That he and Kovalev had an under-the-table deal once again. Everything I'm saying is alleged, just my opinion. But to say that Canelo has not fought great fighters on his resume, I just can't agree with that. I have to...
Thank you, sir. I've been saying that now for years.
Assert that, in my view, Mr. Antonio Reed, in a roundabout way, is trying to figure out how he can get Terrence Crawford to the top of that pound-for-pound list. Just my view of it. And Terrence Crawford, in my view, is the number one fighter in the sport when it comes to all the things that he can do, but his resume is just too weak.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. What have I been saying now for years? Uh-oh. Terrence Bud Crawford's resume is too weak. who's also been saying that now for the past few years. And I agree with you, Judah. Thank you wholeheartedly for saying that because once again, Terrence Bud Crawford has almost 40 fights on his resume now. I believe he now has 39 fights. And the three biggest wins of your career are Victor Postal, who never, in my view, was an A-grade level fighter. He's never going to beat anyone that is truly an A-grade level fighter. Yuri Gamboa, which, it's always very interesting. They always, these same channels, they always love to mention about how when Lomachenko beat Rigondeaux or Nicholas Walters, that they were allegedly out for a year. None of these same guys ever seem to mention that Yuri Gamboa was out for a year. Isn't that interesting? And don't get me wrong, I don't think being out for a year, I don't think that that's enough of an excuse. You can use that excuse if you want to, but most of these fighters are fighting once or twice a year anyway. Maybe if you're out for 2 or 3 years, then okay, I can kind of understand it. But if you're only out for a year, no, I'm sorry, that's not enough of an excuse. It just is what it is. Like no offense, but that's really a bullshit-ass excuse. It just is what it is.
And Canelo Alvarez losing to a fighter at 175, that's not enough for him to lose his spot if you consider him number 1 or number 2 in the world. In the same way when Ray Robinson lost.
I certainly understand that. What I will say is this. First of all, to compare Canelo Alvarez versus Terrence Bud Crawford. Canelo, in my view, when it comes down to when you compare Terrence Bud Crawford's skills and Canelo, Judah has said in the past that he's a stickler for feet. And Canelo, of course, does not always have the greatest of feet. That's understandable. His feet, of course, certainly can be slow, sometimes planted into the ground. I understand that. But Canelo and Terrence Bud Crawford, when you talk about it, I don't view Terrence Bud Crawford as a Floyd Mayweather Jr. type of fighter. And what I mean by that is that there's almost no faults on him. When I talk about someone like a Floyd, Floyd basically had no major deficiencies in his boxing game, just from what I've seen. When you talk about, someone like a Terrence, there is a couple of deficiencies that I do see. First of all, I don't like the way that he keeps his hands down some of the times, and it has caused him to get hit a little bit too much. I don't think that there's any doubt that Canelo is more defensively responsible. I also would probably give the advantage to Canelo in terms of slight head movement because I don't like the way Terrence's chin is wide up in the air. And in some of his fights, he just gets hit way too much. Even sometimes against literally bottom of the barrel opponents. Sometimes he's even having problems against them. And that was when he was looked at in his prime years. Now, of course, Canelo, had problems against John Ryder recently. But Canelo was looked to be on the downslide. When you take a look at Terrence's performances sometimes, he just gets hit way too much. And that's not me saying that he won't kind of adjust to the opponent. But when you take a look at him versus Mean Machine, who I thought he, massively underrated heading into that fight, to be honest with you. But also even against Jose Benavidez or some of the other fighters, he gets hit way, way, way too much.
Lost to Joey Maxim at 175. Did that mean that Joey Maxim should be ranked higher than Ray Robinson in the pound-for-pound list? Of course not.
Well, Canelo, in my view, just because he is coming off of a loss, and I don't like to put fighters recently coming off of a loss at my number 1 pound-for-pound spot, and in my view, Canelo still was the negative 500 favorite, although I didn't have him there because I actually knew who Dimitri Bivol was and how talented and skilled that he actually was. But I understand where Judah is coming from. And for those of you that still have Canelo at your number 1 pound-for-pound spot, I don't mind it at all. I would probably have Usyk there right now, but if you had Canelo Alvarez there, wouldn't have an issue with it at all.
No, I don't even think you understand your own question. He's fighting subpar comp. He just fought Dimitri Bivol. He's a super middleweight at best. He started at junior middle, super middle, who moved up to light heavy to fight the hardest guy to beat in the world.
Well, Canelo did not start at junior middle. He actually had a belt at welterweight. Remember, I believe he defeated Shane Mosley at welterweight.
Is he still ahead of him on a pound?
Yes, he did defeat Shane Mosley, but Shane Mosley, in my view, was completely done. And that's an example of a fighter that is completely done and over with in their career. That's an example of a fighter that is completely done. A lot of people in Canelo's career, they always like to say about how Miguel Cotto and Sergey Kovalev, they were done. No, they weren't done. Miguel Cotto had revitalized his career a little bit by being with Freddie Roach. And remember, that was looked at as a 50-50 fight. That's just because it's always looked at as a 50-50 fight doesn't mean that that fighter ended up being as good as what people thought. But Miguel Cotto was still an A-grade level fighter when Canelo fought him. That fight was looked at as being potentially very competitive. And Cotto tried, in my view. He didn't necessarily look wore down or anything. I just think that Canelo's size and on top of that his boxing IQ and skill that it got to Miguel Cotto. And Cotto was a great boxer, but Canelo's just on a different level. And then of course when you talk about Kovalev, yeah, sure, he was a little bit more wore down and older. There's no doubt about it. But when it comes down to it, like I said, he also was coming off of two great wins at the light heavyweight division. One over Anthony Yard, one over Canelo Alvarez. That's when Canelo fought him. He didn't fight him after he was knocked out like 3 times in a row or something like that, as people like try to implicate. Now, don't get me wrong, he was already stopped a couple times in his career. But if we're going to go by those standards, then we also have to go with the same standards, about Terrence Bud Crawford beating Sean Porter or Terrence beating some other opponents that have been stopped prior. Like these same guys love to say about how Terrence, like, oh, he beats Kell Brook, and Kell Brook was washed. Like, that's an example of a washed fighter. Sergey was at least a champion. That's why I say, like, if you want to be consistent, I may not agree with you, but at least I can have more respect for your opinion and view if I see some sort of consistency.
Pound for pound list because he extended himself way past where he'd be at his best weight to fight Bivol. I might not have him ahead on a pound for pound list, but I can understand the reason. He avoids. He fights subpar competition. Dimitri Bivol is subpar competition.
Yeah, sometimes when you're hating, you lose track of the bullshit that you're saying because you're trying to hide your true agenda. That happens with Woketies a lot. They do so much. They do so much trying to hide what their actual goal is in making the ridiculous statements that they make. They actually condemn their own sentiment.
Time's up. That'll do it for me.
Well, what I'll say is this, and this is pretty much going to be the end of the video after I let it play out for a couple more seconds, but certain people would allege that the reason why Canelo, and Dante's Boxing Nation said this as well, certain people would allege that the reason why Canelo took the fight at 175 is that he'd rather lose there than lose to the fighters that people wanted him to fight all along at his natural weight class, like Andrade and David Benavidez and Charlo. That way he doesn't get further exposed. Do I believe that that's the reason why he did it? Absolutely not, because Canelo had already won a title at 175, a decent 175 pounder, and on top of that, he was favored by the majority of the people going into that fight. So there was not going to be any pressure coming off of Canelo Alvarez either way. The only way that that's going to work is if it actually takes pressure off you in terms of what Kell Brook did against Gennady Golovkin or what a Mikey Garcia did against a Narrow Spence Jr. It's very interesting. No, for whatever reason, no one ever seems to really get on Mikey Garcia's case, in the mainstream media. But if you really want to talk about a situation like that, go no further than Mikey Garcia and the Kell Brook. But Mikey Garcia, in my view, like literally every time there was a mega threat in one of his lower weight class divisions, the man would always have some sort of excuse to why he wasn't able to take that fight. And once again, people always try to say that Canelo, he's been ducking and dodging his whole career. That's bullshit, because even if you hate Canelo Alvarez, you can list about 10 to 15 names on his resume just off the top of your head. Mikey Garcia, you can't do that. Or Adrian Broner, you can't do that. And Adrian, I don't think avoided anybody, but he just didn't really beat anyone that was that good or that great anyway. Mikey, for example, it's like, who are the 5 to 10 biggest wins in his career? Like, I can barely mention them. Probably Roman Martinez, Orlando Salido, Adrian Broner, Zlatan Satichinin, and, probably Jesse Vargas. Like, none of those guys are great fighters, man. Like, none of them. And the reason why he went up to 147 in the first place is because he was scared to death to fight Vasily Lomachenko. Lomachenko kept calling his ass out, and he didn't want to potentially get his ass whooped down there. That's the reason why Mikey did that shit.
Do it for Max Me Anything. Tweet!
But that will be it for this segment of Max Me Anything. Now we're going to pick up with the next segment of Max Me Anything.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it. I don't want to review any more in order to take any more of his content on Patreon. But anyways, that's pretty much about it. Or review any more of his content on Patreon anyway. But, like I said, I thought that I would review that because Judah's been saying the same things that I've been saying now for a very long time. So just to get to the bottom line of it, myth or reality, where is Canelo Alvarez's resume? The reality of Canelo's resume is that not only does he have one of the greater resumes in boxing today, or of his era, but he has one of the greater resumes in boxing of all time. At the end of the day, he unified a division at 168 completely. All right, so he can call himself one of the few completely undisputed champions in boxing history. On top of that, he's extraordinarily skilled, extraordinarily intelligent as a fighter. He also is a 4-weight division champion, a legitimate 4-weight division champion, and he has a dozen A-grade names on his resume, and at one point in time, for a few years, was looked at as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. There is a great debate, and really no debate about it at all, that Canelo is one of the greatest fighters in boxing history. Undoubtedly. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Just thought that I would talk about that. Thought it'd bring something to the table, especially from a channel that I held in very high regard, or hold in very high regard, excuse me. But anyways, that's pretty much about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.